extraordinarily privileged to have all three of you online. And thank you for making it as well. Jeremy was just joking that the logistics of this have been interesting, his words, not mine, to manage. And we really appreciate the fact that you have joined us on time and on the correct day. So I don't have a particular order of appearance. And I don't know whether we talked about that. I do know possibly that the three of you have connected, but if any one of you wants to go first, as we discussed, we will give 10 minutes for each of you for opening statements and remarks, and then take it from there. So if I may use then the moderator's prerogative, maybe we'll go in the order that it is printed. And with respect to Sarah and Allie, if Susan were to begin, that'll be great.
I'll be delighted. First of all, I'm so grateful for the invitation to join you. I've been listening to you with great interest already, and I'm particularly eager to discuss with the other fantastic panelists and with the audience. So I'll be as brief as possible. I'd like to offer some ideas with which some of you are already familiar, and also some completely new ideas for your ferocious and telling critique, no doubt. So first of all, as you can see in my bio, I founded a little research team called the Dangerous Speech Project after coming up with an idea for a category of speech that is really overlapping with hate speech, but I also present it as an alternative to hate speech. I think it can be useful in certain specific ways. First of all, hate speech, although it's the most common term for offensive, harmful, painful content that attacks groups of people or individuals for being part of a group, doesn't have any consensus definition. And in practice, the definition of hate speech often ends up being quite subjective and varying. Also, hate speech has all kinds of different consequences and can bring about different forms of harm. I apologize if you can hear my cat expressing his own views on hate speech.
Very good.
Dangerous speech is any form of human expression, words or images, or even the color of a piece of clothing in some contexts, that can inspire people to condone or commit violence against another group of people. My colleagues and I think that is particularly useful for a number of reasons. One, it's an objective description of a category. It's not, will I commit violence? It's, what is my systematic, educated prediction about what effect this content will have on some other people? So it's a systematic and objective category. Number two, it's based on a consequentialist test. We're interested not in, for example, what's in the mind of the person who produces dangerous speech. That, by the way, is something we will never know. I don't envy the Facebook Oversight Board, which is at the moment trying to think about Facebook's decision to take down Donald Trump's account, since the reflex of most social media company moderators until now, when faced with a piece of content they're not sure whether to take down, whether it's actionable, as they call it, their reflex is usually to do two things. One, to agonize over how that content could possibly be understood. It is almost always ambiguous. So that leads to lots of argument and delay in decision making. And the second thing they often do is to wonder about the intent of the person who made or spread the content. Now, undoubtedly, over the last 4 or 5 years, most of us, certainly most Americans, have spent some time wondering what on earth Donald Trump was thinking, what on earth he wanted, But frankly, I'm very happy never to do that ever again. I imagine some of you might join me in that. And the more important point is that it is utterly and totally pointless. We will never know what Donald Trump is really thinking. We'll never be able to discover it. So in my view, using intent as an important metric in making decisions about hate speech or dangerous speech is pretty pointless. What really matters is what effect that content will have on other people, what kind of effect it will have in the world. That's what I mean by a consequentialist test. What consequences might it bring about? So finally, we have found that there's pretty robust agreement among lots and lots of people of good faith, even though they are very different cultural and social backgrounds, that mass violence is a bad thing and should be prevented. It's not hard to get people to agree on that, even if they disagree with the reasons why a particular piece of content might inspire violence. They can agree that the violence itself is a bad outcome, a bad consequence. So we find that this notion of dangerous speech allows people who otherwise wouldn't be able to talk together or agree on anything, sometimes to do so. All right, so that's the general notion. Of course, dangerous speech is absolutely not all of the content about which we ought to worry, but I think it's a useful category. So that's the stuff that I've been offering for quite a while in one form or another. Now the new idea has to do with content moderation of such expression. And for that, I want to offer you another absolutely crucial point, which is that nobody gets incited to commit violence by one speech. You know, after January 6th, after the attack on the Capitol, there was quite a bit of wondering about what Donald Trump said in that speech in front of the Ellipse in Washington, D.C., and whether it was clearly and definitively incitement to violence. I think it was, but in many ways, I don't think that matters very much either, along with his intent, since we have tremendous, abundant evidence that many of the people who went to the Capitol that day to attend his Save America rally were already fully incited before they got to Washington, D.C. They were exchanging horrifying messages on their forum, the Donald, describing in explicit detail the violence that they intended to commit and the fact, indeed, that they intended to breach the Capitol building. So something happened long before January 6th to incite those people to violence. That brings me to the most brilliant description of incitement to violence that I've ever seen, which came from a witness at a trial held by the United Nations Tribunal for Rwanda. It has come to be known as the media trial, since the defendants were a newspaper editor and two executives of the notorious radio station RTLM, or Radio Télévision Libre des Mille Collines, it was called. This witness was trying to explain what it was that the defendants, particularly the two executives of that radio station, had done that had really caused harm, that had brought about that unspeakable genocide in which about 500,000 people were killed by hand with machetes. And the witness said that what they really did was almost to pour petrol, little by little, all over the country until one day it would burst into flames. So that's a brilliant description because it captures the fact that incitement is a process. It happens gradually, step by step, drop of petrol after drop of petrol. And the very difficult question in most cases is, okay, which is the first drop of petrol that is, as the tech companies would call it, actionable? And then, of course, what action should be taken? But that's a different question. First of all, at what point should they begin to respond? In my view, the decision to take Donald Trump down after January 6th, although it was undoubtedly a watershed, was also an abject failure. Why? They were defining incitement to violence in the rearview mirror by waiting for the violence to happen. If you do that, there's not much point in prohibiting incitement to violence in law, as in the rules of social media platforms. The point of prohibiting incitement to something is to prevent the something. So finally, let me quickly close with my proposal, which is that instead of focusing on intent and arguing about the possible meaning of those drops of petrol, that social media platforms ought to make use of that vast amount of data, our data, that they have, that they collect constantly, and watch for the actual effect of the drops of petrol, of potentially inciting content coming from influential accounts. They ought to look at how that language is actually, language or other content, is actually being understood by the followers of those accounts. And when they see they could build automated classifiers to look for significant shifts in the response to particular accounts of concern. And when the classifiers detect such shifts, humans would review the responses to that content. When they see that, as absolutely happened in the case of Trump and many other influential accounts spreading ambiguous but highly inflammatory content, when there is clearly a response like we saw in December on the Donald, in response to Trump saying, inviting people to come to the rally on January 6th, he said, "Be there, it will be wild," which indeed is not explicit incitement to violence at all. But his followers responded with messages like, "Okay, boys, B-O-I-S, we've got marching orders." He can't, they said explicitly, they said, he can't tell us exactly what he wants, but he's asking us to go armed. I'm bringing my guns.
Susan, sorry to do this, just
done.
We have two other.
Yep.
Is it going?
So then just to close in 2 sentences, when platforms observe such a response, they would inform the account holder, whatever you mean to communicate, this is how you are being understood. If this isn't what you want, declare that publicly on our platform. If the account holder refused or declined to make such a declaration in clear and unambiguous terms, then the account would become actionable. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I apologize, Susan, for cutting you. Yeah. Is it? It is on. Is it on now? Okay. Yeah. All right. Cheers. Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. This is such a lovely event to be a part of. And I just want to acknowledge how foundational Susan's work has been for my understanding of the space. And I know a lot of people in the industry also share that view. I guess by way of introduction, I mean, I'd love to focus a little bit on building off of what Susan said, how to begin to track some of these impacts of speech. I think what I can share a little bit in my reflection is what that internal dashboard should look like. How do you go about building that? If you are at a platform, what does it look like? And what are the complex partnerships and relationships and mapping and research that needs to be done to do it? I work as an independent consultant in the Valley. Previously worked at Facebook in a research role, and then later an internal coordination role on what Facebook calls conflict countries, but think extreme information environments. And then before that, I worked with reform-minded leaders who were trying to figure out how to use technology in the wake of the Arab Spring, particularly in transition countries. And again, extreme information environments where social media plays an outsized role. I laughed when I saw the title of this panel, Sanjana, because I feel like this is the existential issue of our time. It was the same framing for a conference that I organized in 2016 in the wake of Cambridge Analytica, where I brought foreign elected leaders, Global South activists to Silicon Valley to try to raise awareness about things like hate speech and authoritarianism. And what I did was, when I heard about this conference, was just try to reflect on what have we learned in the last 5 years? What has the industry gotten right? Where are the gaps? And I think where I've landed is that we are fundamentally missing the technical frameworks to talk about things like influence on democracy, influence on society, dangerous speech. What does it look like internally in a company to understand how those things are developing and changing? A lot of what I've seen is just gaping holes between what a company can see and what the reality is on the ground. One of the things that I've done to try to understand how that gap gets filled is just studied a lot of engineering literature. I'm not an engineer, I should say, but I've read a lot on how people think about safety, how different systems get built and constructed. And there's a great book called Engineering Systems, put out by MIT Press. If people haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. But the basic premise is that there's a difference between what engineers are trained to do and now expected to do. And I love the example in the book. They talk about highways. You know, there was once a time to build a highway. All you needed to do was come up with a plan, build the proposal, get the materials, and then construct the highway. Today, obviously, you know, the actual mechanics of doing that is so different. You do environmental impact assessments, right? You engage the community. You have to talk about zoning regulations. You have to think about the cars that are driving on it now in 5 years and 20 years. There's a massive environmental impact assessment that goes into it. And so this is sort of the spirit in which I've started to look at things like, Sanjana, I loved earlier in the day how you talked about high noise, low trust environments. I think that's one archetype of an environment that a company needs to understand. There are probably many more in other axes, in the same way that a highway builder has to think about energy and noise, right? Urban impact and the environment. So how can we begin to think about who will use products and how it will interact with the natural environment, I think is the essential question that companies need to get better at understanding. So I highlight that because I know there's an active and very vibrant discussion about content, which is very important. But just as important, I would argue, is the process by which you're finding that content and the ongoing evolution of systematizing a way to understand new trends, so that when new authoritarian leaders use new practices, you don't have to wait until it reaches a certain threshold to know about it or act on it. So I'll just end with maybe two kind of introductory questions that I think about when trying to probe on this issue. The first is, what sort of feedback loops are in place? Reporting gets talked about a lot. It's not great in a lot of environments, as I think many of the speakers on this event will know. A lot of gaps for a number of different reasons. But if you're not getting good feedback, you're never going to know what needs to change and when there are problems. So what do you do to mitigate that? You know, are you going to send out people to a specific country? Are you going to commission an assessment? Responsible growth today means proactively thinking about how your product will be used or abused and thinking through those sort of questions. And then the second thing I would say is, you know, when your product reaches a certain threshold, let's say the backbone of communication infrastructure in your country, a dominant role in the media environment, what sort of investments are being made to understand how the product is being used in that extreme environment? There's a number of different things that could be done here, but I think things like cataloging incidents around harm, understanding the intersection between dangerous speech and, you know, an event like the Easter bombings in Sri Lanka, for example, is essential as a learning exercise. So this has to become the norm. It can't be an immediate crisis response measure and then learning from this. And I think activists have told this story in a big way in places like Myanmar, and I'm delighted that that will be discussed later, hopefully. We've seen this again with COVID and misinformation, right? There's a big event and then changes. How do we get into the process of understanding these types of dynamics before these sort of crises happen? So I'll leave it there, but really excited about the prospect of this community and practitioners getting better at developing frameworks for understanding environment, context, and impact at a much more granular level than they currently are.
Thanks, Sarah. Really good to see you too, after a long time. Allie, if you want to take the floor.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for having me here virtually. And I'm just honored to speak alongside Sarah and Susan. My name is Allie Funk. I'm a senior research analyst for technology and democracy at Freedom House. We're a US-based organization who's dedicated to defending democracy and human rights worldwide. I run our Freedom on the Net project, which is our global assessment of internet freedom across 70 different countries. So I'm approaching this question, I think, from a more zoomed out angle, and looking at it, how it plays out in different countries around the world. So I'm, sort of going to touch on how government officials have really manipulated these claims of dangerous speech to actually just crack down on journalists, activists, critical speech, opposition figures as well. So, I think a lot of us know in the digital age, governments across the democratic spectrum view weaponizing the internet to be essential for political and social control. So it's not just the likes of, the Chinese government or the Iranian government, it's increasingly India, the world's biggest democracy, as they say, or Brazil as well, these countries that, might not traditionally be seen as fully authoritarian states. So something, that we've seen is its language around, toxic, hatred, violent, extremism language that show up in a lot of the claims to either censor content that governments view as unfavorable, whether it's arresting or tracking activists and journalists or members of the most marginalized communities, or whether they just want to manipulate information in their favor. And I have some interesting examples of this. I mean, Belarus, for example, cited extremist content when justifying a block on a Poland-based website linked to the Belarusian opposition party. And it's particularly around, times of political tension, this sort of ramps up. So think elections, protests, the COVID-19 pandemic. As we speak right now, state officials are manipulating sort of social media for their own political gain during two major protest movements that I wanted to talk about. So, in Myanmar, the military has responded to mass protests against the coup with internet shutdowns and blocks of social media platforms. We also know, thanks to Justice for Myanmar, an in-country civil society group, that the military has earmarked millions of dollars to mine people's phones, to track their live locations and follow their social media content. And then, in India, it's a similar situation unfolding. Millions of farmers are demonstrating against government reforms. Rather than address the legitimate concerns that the farmers have, the Indian government is responding by shutting down the internet and arresting journalists and activists. And sort of the disturbing irony in both of these cases is that it's state officials who are really known as the major purveyors of disinformation and dangerous speech online in these countries. So then, another sort of element that Freedom House is looking at when we think about how the phrase of, violent content or extremist content is being manipulated by governments for their own political gain also has to do with the use of social media surveillance. We found, at least 40 countries around the world are actively monitoring their residents on social media, which equals about over 3 billion people. So basically, I have countless examples. I could go on way past my 10 minutes. And I think we're thinking about how the pendulum has swung. You know, it's traditionally social media as a tool for freedom, and now we're saying, okay, it definitely is tilting toward authoritarianism. But I think any sort of conversation about the risks of these platforms and how we can create effective recommendations to sort of fix the greater risks has to look at how the platforms are still being used for democratic change around the world, and sort of this positive, there's still hope, I think. And I think that's sort of how we move forward from this. So, you know, Sudan, I think, is the really key example that I like to bring up. In the, you know, mass protests since 2018, where people use private messaging apps and public social media groups to galvanize nationwide protests, that actually led to the ouster of a 3-decade-long dictator. And, you know, since then there has been fragile yet democratic improvements in the country. So obviously it's not easy to do this. Activists contend with, you know, pro-government trolls, like I mentioned, you know, who are spreading false rumors and smearing their reputations. And protests can also lead to even more repressive crackdowns, like we saw in Hong Kong. But I think it underscores that those in power, they know that, you know, social media platforms and the internet still is so fundamental to democracy movements. And I think that's why we've seen the majority of governments pass laws to regulate them in a way that really curtails free expression and increases state surveillance. And I think this brings us to the key question, and that, you know, both Sarah and Susan touched on, is how do we craft smart policy, legislative, and technical approaches in response to serious online harms of disinformation, incitement to violence, you know, hatred, incendiary language, but how do we do it in a way that protects human rights and that won't be abused sort of by political leaders, that won't be similar to the new IT rules that are just been rolled out by the Indian government that uses the same language around the dangers of social media to just crack down on encryption and remove content that the government deems offensive to them. So I, you know, have some ideas. I know Susan and Sarah have touched on some really wonderful things. Sarah, you know, the idea of looking at the role of technologists and how to craft actual technology that sort of looks at how different tech is going to be used, either whether that's by journalists or activists. Susan, you raised a wonderful point about no one gets incited to violence by one piece of speech. So looking at how do we, the internet reflects our society, so how do we tackle the societal ills? It often requires other forms of policy intervention outside of the realm of internet regulation. So these are really tough questions, and I'm really pleased to be here to dive into them more.
Tremendous. Thanks, Allie. You know, it's the Kiwi thing to not publicize too much what your competencies and capabilities and experience are. But I assure you, both the 3 speakers here at this panel and every speaker in this conference is significantly more experienced and versed and has put out more output than they choose to kind of share with us. That is why they're in this conference. So we are very grateful for Susan, Sarah, and Allie for sharing what you have. I have 3 questions for 3 of you, quick ones, and then we can open it up. Allie, you know, people tend to forget that it was just almost exactly 10 years ago, a decade ago, that we had the Arab uprisings, you know, erroneously, I think, called the Arab Spring. And then, given your work, has freedom on the internet, literally and metaphorically speaking, declined or increased? And what are the key trends that one sees from that, in a sense, Berlin Wall moment of optimism to now what is a very different kind of sense around looking at all of this? Susan, my question is a very simple one. Why isn't dangerous speech a thing? Why are we still talking about hate speech and debating and discussing so much about a term that I think your output and your work, not just with the project, but in terms of what you've written yourself, bring into sharper focus as perhaps outmoded, outdated with regards to the challenges that we face today? Why aren't we talking more and grounding it to dangerous speech? And Sarah, you reminded me of literally my first memories as a child of 6, where, and perhaps this is harsh to an audience here, and I beg your forgiveness for sharing it after lunch, but I think it is important. As at 6, my first memories were of burning bodies and petrol. That is literally my first memory. I can't, it's one of those things that kind of sticks with you. And that is what happened in 1983, July, and what a lot of us, I as a child and many of us, were either victims of and died as a consequence of, or were witness to and have an indelible memory on account of. And the point I bring this up is that one of our most senior civil servants, Sarah, said that news traveled at 35 kilometers an hour, the speed of the night train or the lorry that took newspapers. And I found it actually worked into my thesis, because today, of course, the information flows are very, very different in speed, in scope, and scale. So from an insider partial perspective, to use a Lederach term from peace building, given that you've kind of been in the belly of the beast and you have experiences prior to and after that sojourn at a company in Silicon Valley, are the tools and frameworks within these companies fit for purpose, given what we have seen in Myanmar earlier, but even today, Sri Lanka, and in so many parts of the world where these companies are called to respond to things in a timely manner that they don't seem to be capable of doing. So 3 quick questions, and then we can open it up. I don't particularly care how you choose to answer them. Anybody wants to take a first crack? Allie, since you're on screen, go ahead.
I can go ahead. Yeah. So since we actually Freedom on the Net started in 2009, so, you know, right before sort of the Arab Spring, and it has been 10 straight years of decline in internet freedom. We have not had one year that it's improved, quite, I think, unsurprisingly. And over the years that, you know, I would sum it up with 3 main trends that are driving the global decline over the past decade. The first is just the rapid rollout of sort of AI surveillance. I'm talking spyware, social media monitoring tools, extraction technology, and, you know, it's really just a wild west of the surveillance market. It's, you know, private companies from democratic countries selling to you know, the most governments that are the biggest abusers. There's Chinese companies selling this. So the lack of privacy globally is really concerning. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has sort of escalated that, while it's normalized things like facial recognition, thermal scanners, other biometric surveillance tools. The second big trend I would touch on is really that there's been a record crackdown in free expression, and every year it's gotten worse. Each year we've said, oh, there's a record number in internet shutdowns. There's a record number of arrests for sort of protected categories of speech under international human rights standards. Well, 2020 was no different. We had over 47 of the 65 countries arrest folks for political, social, cultural, religious speech, often putting people in prison for, you know, 10, 20 years. And then the third category that is really, I think, or trend that has been accelerating over the past year or two that I think is going to be the future, a very concerning future trend that, I don't think is going away anymore, is sort of the rise of cyber sovereignty. And what I mean by that is really this idea that the governments should have a state-centric regulation over their internet, which undermines the traditional vision of an open and free that doesn't have borders. So, you know, China has long promoted this, but, you know, Russia and Iran are also sort of trying to build their own intranets. But then you see other countries who are simply, you know, shutting off international internet connections. They're trying to roll out these new messaging apps that are more connected to the government, and, you know, in response to WhatsApp's privacy policy change, for example. That's the case that the Turkish government was trying to sell their version of the WhatsApp. And yeah, so I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. And it's also sort of these cyber sovereignty provisions like data localization or data retention are sort of being ramped up in, you know, democracies as well. So not a good picture.
No, I didn't expect it to be, but thank you for confirming it. Sarah?
Sure. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's very early days for the range of technical responses and interventions that could be designed to make platforms more aligned with human rights values, safety, and democracy. I think if we look back we might see the last few years as the epoch of virality. You mentioned speed. I think there's been a lot of understanding, and both external and within the industry, thinking about these moments of high engagement, viral content, especially during a moment of crisis, or especially during a highly sensitive moment, right? A piece of information that you see after a major attack is very different from seeing that piece of information in peacetime. So I think that's where there's been a lot of engagement and interest, just based on what I've seen and I've heard people raise. There's a lot of other vectors, right, besides just virality. Everything from the structure of platforms to the individual components to this issue of temporality, right? Think about the influence of content before a major political transition, during and after. How do you even begin to map that out and understand how a platform should operate and the influence it should have in those different periods of time? I think more than the tech, though, I think about the people. Are there enough of the right people to be leading these discussions, fostering these bridge building brainstorms? I think about that a lot. I think macro engineers, macro thinkers, systems thinkers are really what's needed to bridge a lot of the different worlds that we're talking about, from the right space, political science, social sciences, atrocity prevention, crisis response, and the dynamics of how a social media platform might work. And there's always and I'll end on this, the question of building something and rapidly seeing everyone go to an encrypted environment, right? What sort of rapid disruptive changes will happen over the next few years that will require us to rejigger a lot of these technical responses?
And I can assure you that there are people in the room here from Aotearoa, New Zealand, who are looking at exactly that challenge, really. Susan, briefly, if you could respond, then we can open it up.
Yeah, in some ways, it's a wonderful question, but it's sort of funny to be asking me. It's kind of like asking a passionate, I don't know, bodybuilder why everybody else isn't also lifting weights. But I can very briefly offer that hate speech is, after all, the predominant term and concept. It's been around for a while. It prevails, especially in the English-speaking world. And I think hate speech is more familiar and more, ironically, more comfortable an idea for people, especially in the West. If you talk to them about inciting people to violence, again, to mass violence, mass intergroup violence, at first they'll blink and tell you that that's something that happens in far away countries, among weird, uncivilized people, etc. Of course,
Sri Lanka.
Now that we had the riot at the Capitol, that certainly has shaken up this country. But then the last thing is that the term hate speech has been weaponized, as you know, and has become such an important political tool that it would be very hard to compete with it on that basis. But of course, I don't want dangerous speech to compete with hate speech in those terms. I don't want it to become a political tool, but rather a useful tool for for preventing violence and improving the world in whatever small, modest way.